It was a May evening on Bournemouth Beach, the kind that should have been idyllic. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a faint orange glow fading into the dark blue of twilight. The gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore blended seamlessly with the occasional cry of seagulls. For most, this was a place of peace, a spot to escape the chaos of daily life and lose oneself in the beauty of nature. But that evening, the usual tranquility felt off. The area known as the 39 Steps, a set of weathered stone stairs leading to a secluded part of the beach, carried an unnerving air. Named after Alfred Hitchcock's classic thriller, the location had always carried a slight mystique, but tonight it felt different, darker. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tufts of wild grass that lined the edges of the steps, as if the night itself was whispering a warning. A lone figure descended those steps, moving with deliberate purpose. Clad in dark clothing, the person seemed to blend into the shadows, their movements careful, calculated. They carried a bag slung over one shoulder, its contents unknown to any passing observer, but essential to the deadly mission ahead. The beach below was sparsely populated, the late hour driving most visitors home. A couple strolled in the distance, their voices carried faintly on the breeze. A jogger's figure was just visible on the far side of the sand, their rhythmic steps gradually fading. But none of them noticed the figure emerging from the steps, sticking to the cover of shadows and blending seamlessly into the environment. Beneath the quiet facade of this seemingly unremarkable evening, an ominous tension hung in the air. The figure stopped for a moment, scanning the beach with an intensity that suggested a plan was unfolding. Their breath visible in the cool evening air, they tightened their grip on the strap of the bag and took another step forward. In the distance, the faint sound of laughter echoed from a group gathered near the water. Among them was 27-year-old Amie Gray, unaware of the danger that was quietly creeping closer. This was the last night of her life, a detail she could never have known as she smiled, her silhouette illuminated by the moonlight. And as the figure closed in, unseen by anyone, the beach became the stage for a crime that would horrify the nation. A sense of dread lingered in the air, growing stronger with every step the figure took. Something terrible was about to happen, something that would shatter the peace of this place forever. Nasen Saadi was the kind of student who seemed destined for success. At 20 years old, he was already deep into his criminology studies, a field he approached with an intensity that impressed his professors and unnerved some of his peers. His sharp mind was evident in his essays, which dissected complex criminal cases with a precision that suggested a deep understanding of human behavior. His ability to analyze motives, break down patterns, and theorize about unsolved cases was remarkable even among his competitive cohort. But beneath his academic brilliance lay a disturbing undercurrent. Saadi wasn't merely interested in criminology as a subject of study. He was consumed by it. His fascination with high-profile murders went beyond intellectual curiosity. He would spend hours poring over documentaries, articles, and police reports, not just to understand how crimes were solved, but to delve into the minds of those who committed them. His small apartment in Purley, South London, reflected this obsession. Bookshelves groaned under the weight of true crime literature, their spines emblazoned with titles about notorious serial killers and infamous murders. Posters from slasher films lined his walls, iconic imagery from movies like Halloween and Scream that romanticized the idea of a masked killer stalking their prey. A desk in the corner of his room was cluttered with notebooks, many of them filled with detailed notes about crime scenes, forensic techniques, and infamous cases that had captured headlines. Saadi's fixation wasn't limited to his private life. In seminars and group discussions, he often steered conversations toward the grislier aspects of crime. When others were disturbed by the details of a particularly violent case, Saadi seemed intrigued, his eyes lighting up in a way that made more than one classmate uneasy. Then there were his views on women, which he barely concealed. He often spoke dismissively about female victims in the cases they studied, framing them as weak or naive. Over time, his peers began to notice a pattern. His fascination seemed to center on crimes against women. For Saadi, these weren't just stories, they were puzzles, and the victims were nothing more than pieces in his twisted narrative. His professors noticed too. While his essays were often brilliant, they also carried an unsettling tone, as if Saadi admired the killers he was writing about more than the detectives who caught them. Yet any concerns were brushed aside. He was a criminology student after all. Wasn't it normal for someone in his field to be engrossed in the darker side of human behavior? But Saadi wasn't normal. His interest in crime wasn't purely academic, it was personal. He idolized killers not for their cunning but for their infamy. He didn't just want to study them, he wanted to join their ranks. In his mind, the line between fascination and action had already blurred, and as he continued to study the cases that had gripped the public's imagination, Saadi began to see himself not as an observer, but as a future headline. To those who spent any significant amount of time with Nasen Saadi, it was impossible to miss the signs that something wasn't quite right. His peers in the criminology program often joked about his enthusiasm for the darker aspects of human behavior, but beneath the laughter was an unease they couldn't quite articulate. One of the most glaring red flags was Saadi's attitude toward women. His misogynistic remarks, often cloaked as casual comments, would emerge in group discussions. When analyzing cases involving female victims, Saadi would question their choices with a tone that felt less like critique and more like contempt. She put herself in that situation, he once remarked during a lecture about a stalking case. His words were often met with uncomfortable silence or nervous laughter, but few pushed back. It was easy to dismiss his remarks as immature rather than malicious. Beyond his comments, Saadi had a morbid way of steering conversations. Whether in casual chats or academic debates, he found ways to inject macabre details about murders, often going into unsettling depth about the methods killers used. When others found these discussions disturbing, Saadi seemed to revel in them. "It's just research," he'd say with a smirk, brushing off concerns. To him, this was all part of mastering his field. Saudi's fascination with murder extended outside the classroom. At social gatherings where conversations would drift toward lighter topics, Saadi would bring the mood down with unsolicited stories about real-life crimes or obscure slasher films. It wasn't uncommon for him to describe a crime scene with such vivid detail that his audience would fall silent, unsure whether to laugh it off or leave the room. A few classmates did raise concerns, particularly after he shared a disturbing fantasy about how easy it would be to commit the perfect murder. But these warnings were dismissed by professors as overreactions. "He's passionate about criminology," they'd say. "It's not unusual for students in this field to be fascinated by crime." No one wanted to see Saadi's behavior as a true danger. Looking back, it was all so obvious. The signs had been there for anyone who cared to look. His obsession with violent media, his dehumanizing views, his peculiar thrill in discussing murder. But in the moment, those red flags were ignored, excused, or brushed aside. No one realized that Saadi wasn't just studying crime, he was preparing for it. Amie Gray was a vibrant and determined 27-year-old who seemed to radiate positivity. Described by her friends as warm and adventurous, she had an infectious laugh that could brighten any room. Originally from a small town in Dorset, Amie had moved to the bustling city of Bournemouth to chase her dreams of working in event planning. Her passion for creating unforgettable experiences fueled her work, and she was known for her creative spark and meticulous attention to detail. That evening, Amie had decided to unwind at Bournemouth Beach after a particularly long day. The beach had always been a place of solace for her, a spot where she could clear her head and enjoy the calming rhythm of the waves. She loved the quiet moments away from the chaos of her busy life where she could reflect and recharge. Amie was the kind of person who made friends wherever she went. She loved meeting new people, sharing stories, and connecting over shared experiences. She often walked the beach at night without fear, seeing it as a safe haven rather than a place of potential danger. On this particular evening, she had planned to meet up with a few friends near the water before heading home. It was a routine she had done countless times before. But that night, she wasn't alone. Unbeknownst to her, someone had been watching. Nasen Saadi, lurking in the shadows near the 39 steps, had spotted Amie and fixated on her as his target. To Saadi, Amie wasn't a person with dreams, friends, and a future. She was a piece of a puzzle, an actor in the twisted script he had written in his mind. What made Amy's fate even more tragic was its sheer randomness. There was no prior connection between her and Saadi. She wasn't chosen because of anything she had done or said. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, an unfortunate victim of a man determined to turn his fantasies into reality. As Amie stood near the shoreline that evening, the gentle breeze brushing through her hair, she couldn't have known the danger that was creeping closer. Her final moments were filled with the peace and beauty of the beach, unaware of the dark intentions of the figure who had been watching her every move. She was everything Saadi was not: kind, optimistic, and full of life, and in his twisted mind that made her the perfect target. The 39 steps at Bournemouth Beach were more than just a passage to the sand. They were a local landmark steeped in intrigue. Named after Alfred Hitchcock's classic thriller, the steps had long been associated with mystery and suspense. Carved from aged stone and weathered by the salty sea air, they descended from the clifftop to a secluded stretch of beach, partially hidden from the bustling main promenade. For Nasen Saadi, this location wasn't chosen by chance. He had an unsettling appreciation for the symbolic weight of the steps. In Hitchcock's film, the 39 steps represented deception and danger, a motif that fit perfectly with Saadi's twisted plan. The relative isolation of the area provided the privacy he needed, away from the watchful eyes of passers-by or surveillance cameras. Saadi had scouted the location weeks before the crime, taking note of its features and potential risks. He observed the times when the area was busiest, ensuring his chosen moment would coincide with a lull in foot traffic. He noted how the shadows from the cliffs grew longer as the evening progressed, providing natural cover. Even the ambient noise of the waves seemed to play into his hands, masking any sounds that might alert others to his presence. During one of his scouting trips, Saadi had walked the steps with the casual demeanor of a tourist, but his mind was focused on the details. He counted the seconds it took to descend, calculated his escape route, and noted the placement of nearby benches and pathways. His attention to detail was chilling, as if he were choreographing a macabre performance. To Saadi, the 39 steps weren't just a location. They were part of his narrative. The ties to Hitchcock's thriller fed his delusion of creating a story that would capture the world's attention. The very name of the steps carried an air of infamy, and Saadi intended to amplify that association, using the location to stage his twisted fantasy. Nasen Saadi's crime wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It was a meticulously planned execution. Over weeks, he assembled what he chillingly referred to as his murderer's toolkit, a collection of items designed to ensure his success and avoid detection. Each item served a specific purpose, chosen with the cold logic of someone who had studied crime not as an outsider, but as an aspiring participant. Central to his toolkit were the knives. Saadi didn't settle for ordinary kitchen knives. He had researched and purchased blades advertised for their sharpness and durability, ensuring they could inflict maximum damage. One of the knives was serrated, designed to tear through flesh with brutal efficiency, while the other was straight-edged, perfect for precise, targeted cuts. Both were purchased online under a pseudonym, delivered to a PO box to avoid linking them directly to him. To minimize forensic evidence, Saadi included latex gloves and shoe covers in his kit. The gloves were industrial grade, resistant to tearing, and the shoe covers ensured he wouldn't leave behind footprints in the sand. He had even taken the precaution of trimming his nails and shaving his arms beforehand to reduce the risk of leaving DNA at the scene. The bag he carried that night contained more than just weapons. It held plastic zip ties meant to restrain his victim if necessary, and a roll of duct tape which he believed could silence any screams. He also packed a change of clothes, understanding the importance of shedding any garments that might carry blood or fibers linking him to the crime. But what was perhaps most disturbing about Saadi's preparation was the notebook tucked into his bag. In it, he had sketched crude diagrams of the 39 steps, alongside notes detailing the movements of people he had observed during his scouting trips. There were even calculations of how long it would take him to commit the crime and flee the scene, written in a detached, almost clinical manner. Saadi's toolkit wasn't just a collection of items, it was a manifestation of his calculated intent. Each piece represented a step in his plan, a safeguard against failure. To him, this wasn't just a crime, it was the culmination of years of obsession, a dark fantasy brought to life with chilling precision. And as he walked down the 39 steps that night, bag slung over his shoulder, he believed he was untouchable, his meticulous preparation ensuring he would become the infamous figure he had always dreamed of being. The air on Bournemouth Beach that evening carried a deceptive stillness. Amie Gray stood near the shoreline, enjoying the calming rhythm of the waves, her laughter mingling with that of a friend she had met up with earlier. The dim moonlight cast long shadows, creating pockets of darkness that seemed to move with the shifting wind. It was from one of these shadows that Nasen Saadi emerged, his calculated steps muffled by the sand. Clutching the serrated knife from his meticulously prepared toolkit, Saadi moved with the cold resolve of someone whose fantasies had reached their grim climax. To him, this was no longer a mere plan. It was the realization of years of dark obsession. He had envisioned this moment in excruciating detail, the approach, the act, and the aftermath. His mind was a storm of twisted excitement and chilling focus. As Saadi closed in, Amie and her friend turned, startled by his sudden appearance. Before they could react, Saadi lunged at Amie with brutal force, the blade glinting in the faint light before plunging into its target. The attack was swift and calculated, each strike delivered with the precision of someone who had studied violence as an art form. Amy's scream was cut short, drowned out by the roar of the waves and muffled by Saadi's relentless assault. Her friend, frozen in terror for a moment, broke into a desperate run, her own screams piercing the night. Saadi turned his attention toward her, chasing her down with the same chilling determination. Though she managed to evade him briefly, a deep slash to her arm left her bleeding and disoriented. The commotion was enough to alert a distant jogger, whose shouts startled Saadi and disrupted his plans for complete control over the scene. Realizing he was exposed, Saadi fled into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The beach was left in chaos. Amie lay motionless on the sand, her friend clutching her wounded arm, and the distant sounds of emergency sirens began to fill the night. Saadi's dark fantasy had been realized, but the meticulous killer was far from done. As the blue lights of police vehicles approached Bournemouth Beach, Saadi was already enacting the next phase of his plan, erasing himself from the crime. His escape route, pre-planned and rehearsed, took him through a series of back alleys and poorly lit streets where CCTV coverage was sparse. He knew the importance of avoiding digital footprints every step. Every turn was calculated to evade detection. Once back in the safety of his small apartment, Saadi wasted no time. The clothes he had worn during the attack were stuffed into a garbage bag, doused with bleach, and disposed of in a dumpster far from his home. The knives, now stained with Amie's blood, were wiped clean with industrial solvents before being buried in a wooded area he had scouted weeks earlier. Even the gloves he wore were incinerated in a small, portable burner he had acquired for this exact purpose. Despite his efforts to eliminate physical evidence, it was Saadi's arrogance that stood out. He believed he had outsmarted the system. He had avoided CCTV cameras, left no obvious DNA at the scene, and carefully staged his escape. To him, the police would be chasing a ghost, while he remained free to bask in the dark satisfaction of his actions. But what he didn't account for was the trail he had already left behind. For all his meticulous planning, Saadi had overlooked one critical element: his digital footprint. As investigators began piecing together the events of that night, they delved into every possible lead. Witness testimonies and the wounded friend's account provided a basic description of the attacker, but it was the deeper, unseen trail that unraveled Saadi's carefully constructed facade. A forensic analysis of Saadi's online activity revealed a damning pattern. His internet search history was a chilling roadmap to his crime. He had researched the mechanics of knife wounds, studied the best ways to avoid leaving forensic evidence, and even watched tutorials on disabling surveillance cameras. Orders for knives, gloves, and solvents were traced back to accounts linked to his IP address. But it was the content of his searches that truly shocked investigators. Saadi had spent hours reading about high-profile murders, often focusing on the mistakes that had led to the killer's arrests. He had even searched for information about the very beach where he committed the attack, examining maps and photos to perfect his escape route. His fascination with crime had left a virtual breadcrumb trail, one that painted a chilling picture of premeditation. The arrogance that had driven Saadi to believe he was untouchable was the very thing that betrayed him. Every search, every click, every online purchase became a piece of evidence, meticulously documented and added to the growing case against him. The investigation into Amie Gray's murder and the assault on her friend was methodical and relentless. Led by seasoned detectives from Dorset Police, the team combined traditional police work with cutting-edge forensic techniques to identify their suspect. The first breakthrough came from the jogger who had witnessed Saadi fleeing the scene. His description of the attacker, though limited, provided a starting point. Combined with a friend's account, investigators began narrowing down potential leads. Surveillance footage from nearby streets, though sparse, captured glimpses of Saadi's escape route, allowing police to trace his movements. As they dug deeper, the digital evidence became the cornerstone of their case. Cyber specialists uncovered Saadi's incriminating search history, tying him directly to the planning and execution of the crime. His purchases of knives and other tools were matched to receipts found on his online accounts. Even his use of anonymized email addresses and PO boxes couldn't fully mask his identity. Forensic teams scoured the wooded area where the knives were eventually discovered, uncovering traces of blood that matched Amie's DNA. Witnesses who had seen Saadi on the beach during his scouting trips came forward, their testimonies further solidifying the case. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Saadi, who had fancied himself a mastermind capable of evading capture, had left behind enough evidence to build an unshakable case. When the police finally arrived at his door with a warrant, he was calm, almost smug, as if he believed his meticulous planning would save him. But the weight of the evidence told a different story. Saadi's reign of terror was over, and the investigation that had consumed weeks of tireless work had finally brought justice to Amie Gray. The arrest of Nasen Saadi was a carefully coordinated operation carried out under the cover of early morning. As the sun rose over South London, casting a faint orange glow over pearly detectives and armed officers quietly surrounded Saadi's small apartment. Every detail had been considered, there was no room for error. Saadi had proven to be methodical and dangerous, and the team was prepared for resistance. When the officers knocked on his door, their voices firm but controlled, Saadi opened it without hesitation. He stood there, calm and composed, as if he had been expecting them. His dark eyes met those of the lead detective with an unsettling stillness, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. He didn't ask why they were there, nor did he protest as they moved to place him under arrest. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment, almost relishing the attention it brought. Inside his apartment, officers found a space that mirrored Saadi's disturbing mind. Books on criminology, murder, and forensic science lined the shelves, alongside notebooks filled with detailed entries on high-profile killings. But most chilling was the absence of anything personal. The apartment felt more like a crime library than a home, devoid of warmth or personality. As Saadi was led away in handcuffs, his demeanor remained eerily calm. Neighbors who had gathered to watch the scene unfold later described him as cold, almost robotic, his face devoid of emotion. For Saadi, this wasn't the end of his story, it was the beginning of the notoriety he had craved. The interrogation room was stark and silent, save for the low hum of the overhead lights. Nasen Saadi sat across from two detectives, his hands cuffed in front of him, his posture relaxed. Despite the gravity of his situation, Saadi seemed entirely unbothered, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he waited for the questioning to begin. The lead detective began methodically, laying out the events of the night on Bournemouth Beach. Saadi's response was nonchalant. "You think I did this?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Do I look like someone who would make such an obvious mistake?" His tone was casual, almost mocking, as if the entire situation was an inconvenience rather than a life-altering event. When presented with evidence, the witness testimonies, the recovered knives, and the damning digital trail, Saadi's arrogance only grew. He dismissed the findings with an air of superiority, claiming they were circumstantial or fabricated. "You've got nothing solid," he scoffed, crossing his arms. "You're grasping at straws." But the detectives were unshaken. They knew this wasn't just a battle of evidence. It was a psychological chess match. Each time Saadi tried to deflect, they countered with another piece of their case. The recovered bloodied knife matched to Amie Gray's DNA. The digital searches linked directly to his devices. The items purchased under a pseudonym traced back to his bank accounts. With each revelation, the walls closed in on Saadi. Still, he refused to crack. Even when confronted with undeniable proof, he maintained his innocence, smirking as he leaned forward and said, "You'll never make it stick." It was clear that Saadi's arrogance wasn't just a defense mechanism, it was a core part of his identity, a chilling reminder of the twisted mind behind the crime. The case against Nasen Saadi was a complex puzzle, but every piece fit together with chilling precision. The prosecution, armed with a mountain of evidence, worked tirelessly to ensure that no detail was overlooked. Their goal was clear: to prove beyond any doubt that Saadi had planned and executed the murder of Amie Gray. Witness testimonies were the foundation of their case. The friend who had survived the attack provided a harrowing account of that night, describing Saadi's methodical brutality in chilling detail. The jogger who had seen Saadi fleeing the scene added another layer of corroboration, helping to establish the timeline of events. Forensic evidence further solidified the case. The knives recovered from the wooded area bore traces of blood that matched Amie Gray's DNA. Even Saadi's attempts to wipe the blades clean had failed to remove every trace. Fibers from the clothing he had discarded were matched to samples found at the crime scene, linking him directly to the attack. But it was the digital trail that delivered the most damning evidence. Cyber specialists meticulously reconstructed Saadi's online activity, presenting a timeline of his preparations. His internet searches, purchases, and even anonymous accounts painted a picture of premeditation so detailed that it left little room for doubt. The prosecution highlighted Saadi's fixation on high-profile murders and his attempts to emulate their notoriety, turning his own fascination into a weapon against him. The notebooks found in his apartment were the final nail in the coffin. Filled with sketches, calculations, and disturbing fantasies, they provided a chilling glimpse into Saadi's mind. The prosecution argued that these writings weren't just academic musings, they were a blueprint for murder. In the courtroom, the evidence was presented with meticulous care. Every piece was a thread in a web of proof that trapped Saadi, leaving him no room to escape. By the time the prosecution rested their case, it was clear to everyone in the room. Saadi's carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing the true face of a killer. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial of Nasen Saadi began. Rows of spectators, journalists, and Amie Gray's family filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the man accused of a crime so heinous it defied comprehension. Saadi entered the courtroom in a neatly pressed suit, his expression unnervingly calm. If he felt any remorse or fear, it was hidden beneath a mask of indifference. The prosecution's opening statement was as chilling as it was methodical. The lead prosecutor painted a vivid picture of Saadi's calculated descent into murder, detailing his months of preparation, his fixation on high-profile killers, and the brutal efficiency of his attack. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor declared. It was the deliberate act of a man who sought infamy through violence. Piece by piece, the prosecution laid out their case. Witnesses recounted the horror of that night on Bournemouth Beach, forensic experts explained the damning evidence, and cyber specialists detailed Saadi's incriminating digital trail. Each detail was presented with precision, leaving the jury visibly shaken by the sheer weight of the evidence. The defense, in contrast, struggled to mount a convincing argument. They attempted to frame Saadi as a troubled young man whose academic curiosity had spiraled out of control. "He is not a monster," the defense attorney pleaded, painting Saadi as a product of societal influences and psychological turmoil. But their arguments faltered under the mountain of proof, and their attempts to humanize Saadi felt hollow in the face of his chilling demeanor. Throughout the trial, Saadi remained unnervingly composed. He listened to the testimonies with a slight smirk, as if amused by the proceedings. At times, he appeared to revel in the attention, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for validation. His lack of remorse only deepened the collective outrage, casting him not as a man seeking redemption, but as a predator basking in his infamy. The courtroom fell silent as the jury returned with their verdict. All eyes were on Saadi, whose expression remained unreadable. The foreperson stood, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "We find the defendant, Nasen Saadi, guilty on all counts." A ripple of emotion spread through the room. Amie Gray's family clutched one another, their tears a mix of grief and relief. Saadi, for his part, showed no visible reaction. He simply stared ahead, his expression frozen in an unsettling calm. The judge's sentence was swift and uncompromising. Saadi was handed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years before eligibility for parole. The judge's words were stern. "Your actions were premeditated, cold, and calculated. You have shown no remorse for the pain you've caused. Society must be protected from individuals like you." Outside the courtroom, a crowd had gathered, holding signs demanding justice for Amie. Cheers erupted as news of the verdict spread, but the joy was tempered by the weight of loss. For Amy's family, the sentence brought closure, but no punishment could bring back the vibrant young woman whose life had been stolen. The trial of Nasen Saadi became a media spectacle, with headlines splashed across newspapers and online platforms. Criminology student turned killer, read one. From studying murder to committing it, the twisted tale of Nasen Saadi, declared another. News outlets dissected every detail of the case, from Saadi's meticulous planning to his unsettling courtroom demeanor. The public was captivated by the irony of Saadi's background, a criminology student who used his knowledge not to prevent crime, but to perpetrate it. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative pieces flooded the media landscape, each exploring the chilling meta-narrative of a man who sought to become part of the stories he idolized. Discussions about the influence of true crime media reached a fever pitch. Was Saadi's obsession with true crime merely a symptom of deeper psychological issues, or had the media itself played a role in fueling his fantasies? The case raised uncomfortable questions about the impact of glorifying violent criminals and the ethical responsibilities of content creators. At the heart of the Saadi case lay a disturbing psychological profile. Experts described him as a narcissist with a deep-seated need for recognition. His obsession with true crime wasn't rooted in curiosity or empathy. It was an extension of his desire for control and notoriety. He idolized killers not for their methods, but for their infamy, seeing himself as a character in the twisted narratives he consumed. Saadi's meticulous planning reflected his delusion of superiority. He believed he could outsmart the system, evading detection and cementing his place in the annals of true crime lore. But his arrogance blinded him to his own flaws, leading to the mistakes that ultimately unraveled his plan. The case highlighted the dangers of unchecked obsession, particularly when combined with a lack of empathy and a distorted sense of reality. Saadi wasn't just a product of his environment, he was a cautionary tale about the perils of losing oneself in a dark fascination. Saadi's case reignited debates about the ethics of true crime media. Critics argued that the constant stream of documentaries, podcasts, and articles sensationalized violence, creating a culture where killers were idolized and victims were sidelined. Others defended the genre, emphasizing its potential to educate and advocate for justice. The ethical line, however, was undeniably blurred. How much responsibility did content creators bear for the influence their work might have on vulnerable individuals like Saadi? Should there be limits to how crime stories are presented, or does the onus fall solely on the consumer to engage responsibly? The case served as a stark reminder of the fine balance between fascination and glorification, urging creators and audiences alike to reflect on the potential consequences of their consumption. The legacy of Nasen Saadi's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom. Universities began reevaluating their criminology programs, incorporating discussions about the ethical implications of studying crime. True crime creators faced increased scrutiny, with calls for greater sensitivity in their storytelling. For the public, the case served as a wake-up call about the psychological dangers of obsession. Saadi's story became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of what can happen when curiosity turns into fixation. Amie Gray's family channeled their grief into advocacy, establishing a foundation in her name to support victims of violent crime. Their efforts ensured that Amie's memory would endure as a symbol of hope and resilience. Even with Saadi behind bars, questions lingered. Could his descent into violence have been prevented? Were there missed opportunities to intervene, red flags that should have been taken more seriously? How do we balance the study of crime with the risk of inspiring those who seek to emulate it? The case left the public grappling with profound and unsettling questions about human nature, the influence of media, and the thin line between fascination and action. It was a story that defied simple answers, one that would haunt the collective consciousness for years to come. In the end, Saadi's desire for notoriety backfired. His name became synonymous not with genius, but with hubris, a chilling reminder of the devastating consequences of obsession unchecked.